I wanted to talk to Rachael because of her book, What is a Girl Worth? My Story of Breaking the Silence and Exposing the Truth About Larry Nassar and USA Gymnastics. You're talking about a woman in Rachael Denhollander who is at the center, really, of a record-setting $500 million settlement with Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics. And I wanted to talk to her about the culture of gymnastics and how all of this happened. So thank you, Rachael, for joining us. How difficult, I don't even know if this is too broad a question, how difficult was it for you to write that book?
Oh, it was incredibly difficult. In fact, for a long time I said I wasn't going to do it. But it kind of got to the point where I felt like the things that needed to be said, the benefit of them outweighed the great cost that was going to come with putting those things into words.
And so when you wrote the book and when you put that out there, how much, and instantaneously, before it became a movement and one of the great scandals we've ever seen across sports, how long was the period of discomfort afterward where you had come after USA Gymnastics in a way that was viewed as some sort of betrayal because of the culture of gymnastics?
You know, I would love to say that there was a period and that ended, but to a very large degree it hasn't. If you look at the behavior of USAG's athlete representatives this week, if you look at the behavior of some of their former officers, some of their current judges, it's been absolutely vile. And the continued characterization of survivors and advocates has been you're bitter, angry people who are just out to ruin the sport. I wish I could say that the narrative has changed, but it really hasn't. USAG is still treating this like a publicity problem, not an abuse problem. And they're still treating us like the problem.
So you're viewed as a traitor from within this community?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, that's not abnormal for sexual assault victims. That's actually the norm. Whistleblowers and advocates who speak up are usually viewed as betraying the community, when in reality, they're desperately trying to save the community and the people who are in it.
How can that be, and how disappointing is that to you, given that I'm guessing that you feel dehumanized from within this, that it can still be so after you've exposed somebody that all of us outside of USA Gymnastics are and Michigan State are saying, how could any of this have been tolerated?
You know, the answer to that really comes down to what we culture, our culture and what we prioritize. And that's the same. That's the same reality for any institution that turns on survivors like this. Whether we're talking about religious institutions, sports institutions, physical communities, your alma mater, your political party, it is a consistent pattern that when survivors and advocates speak up against corruption in their own party, they're viewed as betraying the party, betraying the institution, betraying the community. And that's because more often than not in our community, we value something else other than the truth, something else other than doing what is right. Maybe that's a political goal, maybe it's an athletic goal, maybe it's a religious goal, but something else matters more than the truth and what's right. And we're still seeing that with USAG. Something else matters more than the safety of their athletes, namely money and medals.
Rachael, are you made to feel like you broke away from a cult?
I don't know that I define it as a cult just because that has significant religious overtones to it, but an insular community, absolutely. A community that has required complete subservience to their structures, absolutely. And I think that's what's important to recognize with USAG is we're not talking about one bad doctor. We're not talking about one bad apple. We're talking about a culture that was so rife with physical, sexual, and emotional abuse of its athletes, from its top coaches and leaders all the way down to its physician, all the way down to its club-level gymnasts. USAG has been infested and run by an abusive culture, really during its entire existence. It has shaped our entire understanding of the sport and healthy coaching practices and what it means to be involved in the sport of gymnastics. So as much as USAG really wants to paint this like it's one bad doctor, it's one bad apple, the reality is that the sport is infested and built on a framework of abuse.
How has it changed since your book and since this movement and since the public shaming of the team doctor?
Change has been very slow to come. I think we have seen, to a degree, some change. The fact that Simone Biles had the ability over this Olympics to say, this is not safe for me to do, and to walk out with a coach who was supportive, that's an incredible change. That's something that we've been fighting for, the right of athletes to have autonomy over their own bodies, and prioritizing the health and safety of our athletes above anything else. That's an incredible change. That being said, we still have many, many coaches in USAG who are very abusive. We have leaders who have been part of the old system. We have current and former leaders and athlete representatives who are literally pining away for the old system, who looked at the fact that Simone exercised autonomy over her body, and then an athlete representative who wished for the good old days of Marta Karolyi. An incredibly abusive structure. Our athletes were so systematically starved in USAG that when they were at the Olympics and world competitions, they actually would go through the hotel looking for food that was thrown out on food service trays to eat. That's how bad our elite athletes were abused under Bella and Marta Karolyi. So to have the athlete representative pining away for that system and talking about his respect for Marta Karolyi, that's a massive signal right there that the understanding of abuse has not changed. The desire to recognize abuse and to stop abuse hasn't changed, and that leaves all of our athletes at risk.
I've never understood the Karolyi dynamic. I've never understood that Marta Karolyi, as you mentioned, is still out here advocating for this abusive thing that she would file under discipline as working, correct? As being successful, because look at how successful our gymnasts are.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's not just Bella and Marta that still defend that old system. It's, like I said, USAG's current athlete representative, the one that athletes are supposed to be able to go to with concerns, is defending the old system and talking about his respect for Marta and how it was better under that system. You have judges who have been mocking our athletes and again, pining away for the old system, expressing words of support for some of the most abusive coaches in the USAG system. These are USAG-certified judges that these girls have to compete under, and they're mocking these athletes and pining away for some of the most abusive coaches in the system, not just Bella and Marta, but the reality is that most of our elite coaches are known abusers and have been known abusers for decades. It's not just Bella and Marta. It is an entire system that was built on abusive framework.
Can you give us other examples, other details of the abuse extremes you're talking about beyond the sexual? When you mention starved literally and taking food off of hotel trays, can you take us through what this abuse looks like and feels like?
So, the amount of control that a coach exhibits over an athlete is extreme. This is the same whether it's a low-level gymnast or an elite athlete. So I grew up in Michigan, and one of the most prominent gyms in Michigan was a gym called Twistars. It was coached by John Geddert. And I didn't train under John. The gymnastics is an insular community, and all of us knew how abusive John was. All of us did. We all knew that his athletes weren't allowed to go out to dinner after meets and that they were afraid to eat in front of him, that he restricted their food so severely that they were dramatically underweight, and that eating disorders were a significant problem. Eating disorders are a significant problem in gymnastics from the lowest levels all the way up to elite athletes. In fact, there's a current coach at USAG who still owns one of the gyms, one of USAG's most prominent gyms, and he had an athlete who died of her anorexia. He had another athlete who broke her neck training a vault that she wasn't prepared to train, and she also died. So when you have that level of control over your athletes, where you are able to dictate absolutely everything they eat and everything that they can do, it's an incredibly unhealthy, abusive system. And it was to the point that when these girls would go to competitions, their coaches would search their gym bags to make sure they didn't have a granola bar. The girls were literally searched to make sure that they weren't bringing food into their hotel rooms or into these complexes. Some of them would have to have family members sneak or mail food and hope the packages wouldn't get searched. Some of them would go through the halls and look for food that was left out on food service trays because they were starving in this system. And that's just one example of a type of abuse that was rampant in USAG, the systematic starvation of our athletes and the absolute control over everything. The fact that you could search a child's gym bag to make sure they don't have a granola bar, and then also search an adult's gym bag to make sure they don't have a granola bar, should indicate to us the amount of abusive control that USAG had over their athletes from the top down.
Can you explain to me how difficult it is for a young girl during her formative years to come up through this culture and be a fully functioning, normal, however it is you do those definitions, adult, given the amount of scarring that happens during the formative years in the specifics of this culture?
The abuse follows forever. Absolutely forever. Because when you're subjected to this level of abuse at a young age, what it really does is it entirely reshapes your perception of reality and normalcy. Because everybody around you is telling you this kind of behavior is normal. It's normal to be starved. It's normal to have constant chronic injuries. It's normal when you have an injury, to be told, well, you think you're hurting, but you're not actually hurting. You're just being weak. It's normal to be belittled and told that you're worthless and you have no value and you're never going to amount to anything. Your entire perception of what is normal and healthy is completely warped and skewed. And now what we now know with our understanding of the neurobiology of trauma is that, especially when that happens in the formative years, that actually rewires how the brain and the body work. It rewires our neural connections. It rewires our normal chemical responses so that things that should feel safe and should elicit chemical responses that calm our bodies down and that invoke those feelings of safety and security, those responses don't work anymore. And the responses, like when our body releases cortisol and adrenaline in response to fear, those types of body responses start happening way more than they should, which leaves gymnasts, any kind of abuse survivor, in a state of hypervigilance, often with anxiety and depression issues, because the chemicals that control our emotions are so radically off balance. It results often in a cascade of other physical ailments, digestive and heart problems and autoimmune issues, because of the constant stress of the body's organs being flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And your brain works completely differently, because all of the neural connections that are supposed to form in response to a normal, healthy environment form in response to abusive environment. It literally changes everything about you.
From that angle, you must have a unique perspective on all things Simone Biles related over the last month, given that she's the only member of the team to be a Nassar survivor that we know of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to be really careful not to speak for Simone, because her story is her own, and only she knows fully what's going on right now. But in general, understanding of trauma, all of those things are accurate. And one thing that we also know with trauma is that when you have events or circumstances or sometimes even physical things, sights or sounds or smells that are related to your trauma, oftentimes that can actually trigger those trauma responses to kick up even higher. So for a lot of survivors, the Olympics are a very triggering event, not just because gymnastics is at center stage, but because it was during the Olympics that the first IndyStar article came out about the rampant sexual abuse of coaches in USAG. And that is what kicked off the Nassar investigation. That's what prompted me to come forward. It was only a couple of weeks after the Olympics that the first article ran about how Larry was a sexual abuser. It was just before the Olympics, at the end of July, that Simone was being brought around by Steve Penny and doing all kinds of appearances for him, literally while the FBI was investigating the sexual abuse complaints that they had received. USAG never told Simone, even though they knew she was a victim. And so they hid it from her, and they gaslit her. And they used her. They commodified her. And all of those things happen right around this time of year, end of July, beginning of August. So for a lot of survivors, those types of associations really kick those trauma responses back into gear, because, again, you're triggering those neural pathways that formed in response to abusive environments and abusive trauma.
Rachel, are you surprised that more hasn't changed with your book and with your voice? Are you surprised that the culture continues to make you feel traitorous as opposed to somebody who is leading a worthy cause on behalf of taking care of your body?
Again, I wish I could say I was, but I'm really not, because what I and these other survivors are experiencing on a national level is what sexual assault survivors experience all over the world, even on a microcosm level. Having your community, the community of the abuser and the community that you were in, turn on you is the norm, not the exception. Having them continue to believe that you've made it up, or you're in it for attention, or the only reason you keep talking about these things is because you're angry and you're bitter and you hate everybody, that's the norm. That's not the exception. And so I have to say that everything I've been through over the last 5 years, I anticipated, I expected would happen, because this is what happens to sexual assault survivors who dare to speak up. That's why I came forward so publicly. That's why I came out the way I came out, because I knew that this would be the community response. I wish it was different. I wish with everything in me it was changing faster, because our children deserve that, but I'm not surprised.
Did you get any relief from the writing of the book, or did your life get immediately and exponentially harder upon whatever that relief was, if there was any?
Yeah, there is. there's an amount to which it always helps to process things, to put it down, because it forces you to put words to concepts that maybe you don't want to face. And so I do think writing or finding some form of self-expression in general is really helpful. I would never choose to do it for a public audience. I just wouldn't. I believe that the benefits of the book outweigh the significant cost to me and my family of putting it out there, but I wouldn't do it for myself. I would have never done it for any benefit that I get from it, because it's not enough.
So your life's gotten harder, a good deal harder.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It is worth it, but absolutely.
And you knew you were choosing that.
I did.
And you're saying it's a worthy cause, but I can see how, I can see just in the way that you talk about this, that every time you're talking about it, in some ways you're reliving all of this. And it must be a draining burden to have this be so much a part of your public identity. It is.
It's an exhausting place to be. And it really puts your abuse and it puts your identity on display for the world. And I think that's one of the difficulties for every survivor who dares to raise their voices. It does mean that your status as somebody who is victimized becomes part of your identity forever. Now, I think there are really redemptive things that can come from that, of helping survivors find their voice and knowing they're not alone and being able to educate and hopefully make change. And for myself, my motivation is just to do the very best I can with what I have, to be faithful with what I'm given, and to be able to go to bed every night and know that, to the best of my ability, I have been faithful to do what is right, no matter the cost. It is worth it, but it does come at a very high cost. And that's why when I hear society responding to survivors who speak up with, oh, she's just in it for the attention. What kind of attention? Who wants this kind of attention? She's in it for the fame. Nobody wants to be famous for for what was done to them. It fails to understand the incredible cost to survivors of continuing to speak up, and why we so desperately need advocates who aren't part of the survivor community, who can help carry that weight, because it is a very heavy weight for someone to be struggling to heal from their own abuse and yet carrying the weight of all the change on top of it.
If the Nassar details don't change the culture of USA Gymnastics, what does?
I don't think anything does. I think the organization needs to be decertified and razed to the ground and brought back up with individuals who are trustworthy and who have a radically different approach and understanding to healthy athletics and to child protection. I don't think it does change.
And do you think that's possible?
It's really difficult because the USOPC is who certifies USAG, and the USOPC is rotten to the core as well. The USOPC has allowed sexual and physical and emotional abuse of its athletes across all of the Olympic sports, literally for decades. In order for the USOPC to act against USAG, they would have to admit their own complicity and assistance in creating these types of structures, and they don't want to do that. Again, no one is willing to do what is right because it costs too much. They don't want the cost associated of doing what is right. So ultimately, if the USAG is not going to act, and USOPC is not going to act, the only alternative after that, the only recourse is the United States Senate, because the USOPC is a creation of the Senate and it's funded by the Senate. And I think that's where, if anything is going to happen, ultimately that's where it's going to have to happen, because these organizations are too self-absorbed and too invested in their own interest to be trusted to do the right thing. And they've just demonstrated that over and over and over again, over decades.
How are you not screaming with hopelessness, given everything you've just laid out?
I'll be honest, my focus is not on a particular end goal. My focus is on faithfulness, and it has to be, to not be completely exhausted and discouraged by the lack of improvements that we've seen over the last 5 years, not just even in USAG, but in law enforcement, how we investigate and prosecute these kinds of crimes. Your focus really has to be on being faithful to what you've been given, because that's all any of us can do. No one person can single-handedly change all of these dynamics. There are too many things outside of my control to be able to make that my focus, but I can do the very best I can do. I can be as faithful as I can be to do what is right with the platform that I have and with the voice that I have. And that's a choice all of us can make, because all of us have a circle of influence. We all have our social media platforms. We all have our physical communities or our religious communities or our athletic communities. We all have places where we can use our voice We have places where we can speak up and push back against abusive cultures. We all have mechanisms that we can employ to help change the culture and to push for reform. And my hope is that we'll start taking the power that each of us have more seriously and really focusing on being as faithful to do what is right as we can be with the platform that we have, however great or small that may be.
Rachael, thank you for your time and your work.
Thank you.